Okay, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started because it's exactly noon. I'm going to reintroduce myself. My name is Tamara Jenkins. I am the Communication and Engagement Manager for the Illinois Library Association. And I want to welcome everyone to today's ILA Noon Network, Data Storytelling, Structure, Strategies, and Troubleshooting. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to give just one quick housekeeping item. If you have questions during the presentation, please do not hesitate to put them in the chat box. Kate has been gracious enough to state that she's going to answer any questions that you provide, even if she's still, in the presentation mode, or if it's relevant to what she's going to be discussing at that specific time. So please don't hesitate to ask questions. There will be time following Kate's presentation to answer questions, but again, if something comes to mind as the presentation is going on, please put it in the chat box. And with that, I just want to give a brief introduction to our speaker today. Her name is Ms. Kate McDowell, and she is an associate professor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. She is also a former children's librarian and has been teaching storytelling since 2007. Her current research projects are about storytelling at work, social justice storytelling, and what library storytelling can teach the information sciences about data storytelling. And with that, I would like to welcome and present Ms. Kate McDowell.
Thank you so much, Tamara. It's really lovely to be here with you all, even though we are further apart than we might wish we were able to be right now. So I'm going to walk you through some ideas that come from about 13 years of teaching storytelling and also 3 years of teaching a data storytelling course. Specifically, I'm working on ways to develop a toolkit for people like you. I want libraries and nonprofits to be able to benefit from the work that we're doing at the University of Illinois. So before I go into that, I'll just step back for a second and tell you a tiny bit about my background here. So I come from the School of Information Sciences. I first joined that school in some capacity as a student in 1997. It was about a decade after the last name change. When I joined the school, it was called GISLIS, the Graduate School of Library and Information Science. Many of you may know it by that name. It's now called the School of Information Sciences, and I'm one of the people who works on the library end of things in that broader umbrella of the information sciences. I'm sharing with you here 3 things. One is the first library where I ever worked. That is its icon, the Urbana Free Library. The next is a book that I contributed to recently about transforming young adult services and the importance of storytelling in young adult spaces as a dynamic way of communication. And the third piece is from a journal called Currents, which is a national publication about university fundraising. So these are some of the areas in which I work, and Tamara mentioned some more. I'm just putting up for you here some of the people that I've given talks with or done consulting with. I've worked closely with a number of different organizations within the University of Illinois, and I'm so grateful to be part of that amazing university. One thing that we here do at the university when we are talking about our work is we pause to acknowledge the land and the people whose work created our university. So our university is on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Lancashire, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. And I also want to acknowledge the enslaved peoples, primarily of African descent, whose labor built our nation and much of our university too. So I've worked with all these different organizations, and I'm tremendously grateful to be here with you today. I'm going to show you an outline of today's talk in broad terms, and then I'll go to a more detailed one. But basically, we're going to talk about data storytelling from the perspective primarily of storytelling. So I'm going to assume you have data. I'm going to assume you know your data. I'm going to assume that you are probably really familiar with either that you're collecting too much or not enough, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So what I'm going to offer you here today is the piece that's usually missing from the books you're going to find on data storytelling out there. And there are a few now, but it's usually people focus on the data really heavily and not much on the storytelling. So I'm going to flip that for you. We're going to focus on the storytelling, and I'm going to let you tell me about your data. And that's a big part of this project I'm working on right now, is I'm looking for ways to connect with people, to talk about what are the obstacles to your data storytelling. So in brief, we're going to talk about narrative strategies, narrative structures, and then troubleshooting data storytelling dynamics in all of 25 minutes. And I am going to go kind of fast, so I apologize if you miss anything, but the slides are available to you at the end. I've even got a more detailed outline here for you so that in case you want to get back to any ideas, you're able to do that. And the only thing I would ask is if you end up using these ideas, I would appreciate either that if you acknowledge the work that, that I've done, you can, katemcdowell.com is my website, it's easy to find, or if you would just let me know. And I'm gonna have an opportunity for us to stay in contact through a questionnaire and an option to participate in an interview around this project if you would like to at the end, but totally up to you. This is really my offering to you, and I just wanna make sure if you use it, you know how to find it and that you know how to connect with the person who's making it. A lot of this work is based on a paper that's in process of publication right now for a journal all about data storytelling. So, detailed outline. Oh yeah, and also I mentioned the questionnaire and opportunity to stay in touch. I'd also like us to be able to learn from each other before the end of this webinar. I think it's really an important thing about being together live in a space like this. So I'm gonna leave time for that for sure for those who can stay beyond the half hour in the second half of the hour for us to talk more. Okay, so a quick poll. And Tamara's got this set up for you. I just want to know from you so I can get to know you just a little bit. What's more comfortable for you? Is it data or story? So I see that that poll is up there, and that's great. Tamara, it does tell me that hosts and panelists can't vote. So click whichever one comes to mind right now. It can be just a top of your head reaction. I'll be really interested to hear if there's anybody who has trouble answering this question, if both are really comfortable to you. So far in my experience, it's been, oh great, all right, 62% story, 38% data. That's a really nice blend. Usually people can answer that question. I'm just making note of the numbers there for myself. So thank you. That helps me to understand quite a bit. So for some of you, this will be really, some of the data story things that I'll mention are going to be really familiar because you're really immersed in data, and others, you're really immersed in storytelling or story. Absolutely. And you can, Melissa, that's a great example of a kind of response. You can like stories. And I think most people in libraries have some affinity for stories in some sense, right? I mean, that's a lot of what we learned about in our young experiences of libraries, especially if those were relevant for you. So here's how I define data stories. Data stories are presentations. They may not be full stories in some sense, but they are presentations that are based on data and use narrative elements. So what we're going to do today is talk about what some of those narrative elements can be and what you might use in your presentations. So in well-evidenced stories, data serves as that evidence. So I'm talking about true stories here. I'm talking about not the use of the term story where it's about fabrication, nothing fake in this. I'm really talking about how we make our data communicate to people using narrative strategies and structures and how to troubleshoot that dynamic of storytelling. So narrative elements. What's a narrative element? Let me give you an example. The story of the three little pigs. If you're familiar with that, there are three pigs and they each try to build a house, and the first house fails because it's made of straw, and the second house fails because it's made of sticks, but the third house is great because it's made of bricks. And right there you have a structure with 2 attempts at solving a problem and a third one that works that you could use to tell many data stories, many stories of attempting to solve problems where your evidence is based on data that you collected. There are many famous examples of this as well. John Snow, researching cholera, constructed a story from tracking data about water, well water usage. And I don't know what could be more relevant right now in a pandemic than thinking about how people solve disease mysteries using data. There's some sad examples from history. The Challenger disaster, Edward Tufte has shown in a very famous example of data storytelling what went wrong with the way that that information was being conveyed, which you could call data visualization, but ultimately it leads to a story in our minds. So it is a kind of data story and data storytelling. But from that disaster, the space program now has better information. There are lots of ways we could talk about this. So I'll skip on to say, this is the question I want you to be thinking about for our conversation at the end. What's the biggest obstacle to telling your data story? I'll have more examples later, but I'll just say, not enough data, too much data, too little focus on story and too much on data, too little focus on data and too much on story. All of those could be obstacles for you. So I just want you to be thinking about that. Before we go further, I want to pause and say a group called One Story, a design group, made this graphic that I really like and use and cite in many of my presentations because it gets us beyond this idea of what is storytelling in libraries. I love storytelling in libraries. It's where I come from. It's where at least some of you come from, I know. But it's also true that storytelling has brain effects that have been increasingly documented in neurological research. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the things that involve how we connect. A story is how we connect. The story of a person, of their life, and also the story of the data and how it was generated, the story of how a decision was made. These things connect us. On the right-hand side, you'll see that there are other things, including we like stories. We seem to really enjoy them. They connect with our pleasure centers of the brain. And then also they connect across multiple centers of the brain. And that's an interesting fact because it means that we're able to convey something complex and rich about experience through storytelling. So I define storytelling as a dynamic process involving three interconnected sort of elements and actors and agents. So there's the teller over on the right hand, over on the left hand side, the mouth, there's the audience with the ear, and there's the story. And the story emerges in a context where the teller and the audience are in connection in some way. I call this storytelling, what we're doing right now, in great part because I needed some information from you in the beginning. I've offered you the open space to go ahead and talk with me at any point during this presentation. And that means that what I say is going to be impacted by what you share. And that's what live presentation does, even if, and that's what good data storytelling does, even if we're separated by space, if we have that shared time. So the order of these three elements is not graphically important here. Here, the audience is sort of at the top and might look most important, but in other cases, the teller might be at the top and might look most important. What's important is that there are three elements that all interact, and it's that dynamic process that really creates storytelling. So let's get into the first segment of the talk here with narrative strategies, thinking in story ways. Hopefully this is about you coming back to some old friends that you touched on in school, and those friends are character, setting, and plot. Data, a pile of data, a spreadsheet, a compilation of data, something you may have gotten from a dashboard, or maybe you've gathered data yourselves, whatever form you've got it in, if it's a survey data, anything you have. It may not be obvious how that these concepts will apply to that set of data. And what I'm here to tell you is I think it's really important that they do. In order for data stories to resonate and for them to be structured well enough for people to remember more than just a list, which frankly, we don't remember lists very well. They need something like character, something like setting, and something like plot. So these are a little bit analogies or metaphors, but let's just call them definitions for now. So when I think of narrative strategy of character, you're looking for what adjusts or transforms, develops or shifts in that data presentation that you're trying to make. So give you a couple of examples. Any numbers over time, right? If something is on the increase, if something is on the decrease, let's imagine that your library's PR expenditures are going up and then your usage counts also go up. That's a nice chart to have, right? You'd like to put those numbers together, the usage and the expenditures. The chart you don't want is the expenditures going up and the usage going down. The things where we shrug our shoulders and say, well, that's a miracle, is when the usage goes up and the PR goes down. We don't always know why things happen. So it's another thing I'll say is in picking a character, you probably have to be very careful about something like causality, and making those claims only if you really know that this caused that. But usually in numbers over time, we're talking about something like correlation. We're trying to figure out what correlates with what, and what do we think? What do we think based on common sense that we're doing that's making this other thing happen most likely, along with other effects, because anytime you're serving a community, there are many, many things going on. The character in a story can also be the audience's belief or what they think they know. Now, I know that you all are familiar with this probably since you work in libraries from every party you've ever been to. Not that we've had a little break from those for a while, but you often end up telling people things like, well, you might think the library is only a set of books, but really we have programs and computational resources and online databases. And so there's this changing the audience's belief can be the character. I'll give you an example from my class of changing the audience's belief. I had a wonderful student who told the story of bendable plastic straws. You're familiar with these straws, right? So bendable plastic straws were outlawed in New York City recently, and it was an interesting move. The idea was to support the environment, and I would support that idea, certainly. But the effect was interesting. It wasn't quite what they expected, because those bendable plastic straws, my student pointed out, were actually developed for people in hospitals, people struggling with various kinds of disabilities, permanent or temporary, who would need to be able to get liquid into their bodies in an easier way. And so that belief structure that we kind of came in her story, believing that plastic straws were bad and legal bans on plastic straws were good, she ended up shifting our perspective to help to see more people's experiences, and to include more perspectives in that, and to take seriously the idea that people in hospitals and people with various kinds of disabilities might need plastic straws. They might be the best option for them. So, so I think you can apply that one. So character, that's a couple of examples. So I did, character from your library, where are you putting effort in and what's changing over time? Character from a belief structure, what do people tend to believe and what do you want them to understand or know based on the evidence and data that you can share? Okay, so let's talk about setting. Setting is the minimal context necessary to understand the actions of a story. If you are one of those people who are my 38% of people here who are really more comfortable with data, then this has probably been a challenge in your life at some point. When you've collected a lot of really rich data, it is very hard to know how much to tell at the beginning just to get people started with this. So I'll give you an example. Like it's easy to set, so let's take it from libraries. It's pretty easy to make the setting of something like a door count, right? Because literally the setting is a library door and the count of the people that go through the door. So it's a very direct kind of setting. People can imagine it easily. Now let's imagine circulation figures and how it varies by collection type, varies by your circulation policies that might be in place in order to make collections available. Different kinds of materials might be more popular or less popular over time. I know that they are. It might vary because of your vendor standards and what data maybe you're not even getting your own circ stats, you're getting data from the vendor in terms of how many people from that barcode set of your library patrons are borrowing things from them. Circulation figures, if you've ever tried to present that to a city council, you will know, I'm not probably telling you something you don't know already, that it requires very careful setting thinking. You have to figure out exactly what part of that you're going to present. You have to figure out exactly what setting is necessary and useful for your audience. The third element I'll talk about here is plot. Now I've given you a more complex thing on plot because because I have a lot of thoughts about plot and I won't share them all today. I'll go very quickly, but a plot shows the audience not only what happens over time, but how it relates to other information and what it might mean. Plot is the way that you're showing as it is each of our responsibility as people who interpret the data that we have. Plot is how you are showing what you think it means. That's how you're demonstrating that. So here are some different narrative strategies around plot. You can look at, I've already talked about this one, change over time in the data. Maybe that's how you structure your plot. You can think about comparing or having some kind of parallel between two things, two kinds of changes. That's a way to structure a plot. You can open with a question, discovery or inquiry process. You can say, I bet you thought that bans on plastic straws were always good, but guess what? Sometimes they have unintended consequences, right? And then that shift in audience's understanding, which is very much related to that as well, where you're going to be contradicting commonly held ideas and hopefully, the way I like to do storytelling, hopefully inviting your audience along with you to understand those ideas based on what you show them in the process of your data storytelling. Okay, so those are some narrative strategies: character, setting, and plot. And here's the recap of those three. And that's just the first of 3 segments that I want to go through briefly. So like I said, I'm going to go fairly quickly. My goal here is to give you tools that will let you really think in storytelling ways as you go back and approach the most pressing data that you have to present. Narrative structures, this is part 2. So I have some successful examples from courses in consulting of narrative structures that have worked for me. You might find other things work for you. So I'll give you some examples and caveats of those. First thing to say is that the typical narrative structure everybody thinks about is a story arc. And if you're not familiar with those, if you get curious about it, just Google the term story arc, story, and then ARC is the second word, and you'll find lots more examples than this one. This is one that a graphic designer made for me. I like to think of this as the chronological structure of story, and I won't go too much into that right now, but think of it as being like how it's structured over time. This is a great way to describe what a story is, but it's a pretty difficult way to get from a bunch of data to a story. Much more effective to start by thinking in terms of character, setting, and plot. What am I going to need? What am I going to use? Than to just go straight to the story arc. The story arc can be pretty difficult to get to. So I want to show you some classic story arcs from literary theory and walk you through what they might be good for. I'm going to do them actually in reverse order of how I have them here. Slight typo on the slides. We're going to start with the flashlight, go to the mountain, and then go to the cycle, the equilibrium cycle. But it's enigma, hero's journey, and equilibrium. And you'll be familiar with some of this. So with the enigma structure, which comes from a French theorist, Roland Barthes, the idea is that you've got some kind of question, some curiosity, some query, maybe even the reason you collected your data in the first place, and you're using this structure to walk your audience through the story. So you're saying, I wonder how many people come through here on a Thursday as opposed to a Saturday. And then you show data to indicate what that number is. You use data from Google Maps. There's all kinds of data around for us. But the emotional impact in the process is some kind of mystery or question, and then some kind of satisfaction, some kind of answer to that question. So it's a great structure for data stories. It can be the whole arc of the story. The full arc can be designed around opening with a question and answering that question, or you can ask a question and answer a question, ask a question and answer a question. So there can be kind of a subset. This is one structure that works at the macro and micro levels. The hero's journey structure you are probably familiar with. And what I'm here to tell you is that it's a great structure. It's amazing for things about awe. It's amazing for transformation. The joy of watching a hero come to triumph is the whole point of this story structure. I love our libraries, but we rarely function as heroes. We usually function as helpers in someone else's journey. I'm actually working on an article about this too, called The Helper's Journey. So when you think about the hero's journey and Joseph Campbell, you may think that you've found the universal story structure, and of course it's very compelling, and it's in many, many novels and movies and video games and anything you care to name. But I'm here to tell you it's not totally universal. Not only is it not culturally universal, but also it doesn't always work, because sometimes if someone doesn't have the evidence to back up what they're claiming, if they don't have the data to show that this is something truly awe-inspiring, it can kind of come across as overblown if you try to use a hero's journey structure of kind of transformation and wonder and awe. So that one, the first one, the enigma, was the flashlight, sort of the shining the light and finding step by step a question and answer, a question and answer. You turn on the light and you see something new. The hero's journey is about this mountain, and this structure functions at the level of the whole story. So you rarely get kind of a hero's journey embedded in, unless it's a very long story or a very complicated movie or video game. You usually get the hero's journey at the full arc of the data of the story or the presentation, if you want to think of it that way. So when you have really amazing data to show and you really are in awe at a transformation, this is a perfectly appropriate structure. And so it's one that I'd encourage you to think about. And the third narrative structure comes from Russian theorist Svetlana Todorov, and also this folktale from Japan about the stonecutter. And I really love this folktale because it's all about a young man who's a stonecutter, and he makes a wish, and he wishes that he could be the prince that he had seen in a caravan, because he was cutting stones for the prince's palace. And the spirit of the mountain grants his wish, and he becomes the prince. And then after that, he becomes, well, he goes on and on. He becomes the sun, he becomes a cloud. Each time he's fascinated by the power of who he sees. And it comes all the way around until he becomes a cloud raining down on the mountain, and then he becomes the mountain, and then he hears a sound, and it's a stonecutter. And he realizes that the only thing more powerful than a mountain is the stonecutter. And he comes full circle back to where he began. That is the way that an equilibrium story makes you feel. Equilibrium stories are about coming full circle. They are about, if the hero's journey is about return but with transformation, An equilibrium story is about stability and resilience, overcoming challenges, and that reassurance of continuity. I think we are hungry right now for equilibrium stories, most of us, over the last few months. And so finding ways, these are really good story structures for institutions, because often we're talking about where we started as an institution. We showed up at some point in an institution. I showed up at the University of Illinois at this, what became the School of Information Sciences in 1997. And we go through transformations with that institution. Big things happen. There are financial crises. There are unprecedented challenges in terms of things like viral load, words we never really paid much attention to before March 2020 in the United States here. So there are big challenges that we go through, and the story then becomes about what is the evidence, what does the data show about where we were before, what the disruption looked like, and then where we came back to. It need not be exactly the same place. I say full circle, it's more of a metaphor than literally. It might be a slightly different place, but the institution persists, and that's the part of the story. That's the part of the story that's most important to the emotional feeling of equilibrium. Okay, so that's part 2. So let me move on to part 3, the last part of the presentation here, and then I'm going to shift to seeing what questions you have, and also what you can tell me about your data storytelling. So, troubleshooting data storytelling, what goes wrong and how to fix it. This comes back to that triangle that I talked about earlier, and now I want to reframe for you what you saw in that triangle. I told you to look at the teller and the tail and the audience, and this triangle actually has 6 things in it. There's also the connections between the teller and the audience and the tail, and the teller and the tail. Let me tell you that I have a theory that the reason why people often tell personal stories is that the audience can see that the connection between the teller and the tail is very close. It's your own story. So if you think about that way of thinking about what might go wrong in a data storytelling situation, I think this can offer a lot of ways to get out of some of your more thorny things in data storytelling. So let me walk through just a little bit here. Actually, I'll walk through it from right here. I apologize. So the point is that you're not just trying to tell your story, right? You're actually trying to make connections between people, between the teller and the audience. In an ideal storytelling situation, as I see it, the teller and the audience have an opportunity to change places. So you can imagine that the audience needs to have their own relationship to the tail, or in this case, maybe you would say the data, right? The information. The audience needs to have, and this is a tough one in our society right now, but enough information that they can trust the source of the evidence on which the data story is based. This is critical literacy, information literacy. These are things we've all been taught and teach all the time, but this is really important. So not only, so you might have a great relationship with me. You might trust me. I might come from a similar background as you or not, but still we might have, things in common, especially institutional connections, right? And something we could chat about if we ran into each other. And that might set up a good relationship between the teller and the audience. But even if you as the audience don't have that relationship with me as a teller, you might still have a relationship to the content, the information of a presentation, the story that's being told. And so the teller has to respect that and remember that it's not always about us, it's not always about me. It's often about the audience and their connection to the content and what's being shared. So this is really important when it comes to thinking about how much data to share, because you have to think about what an audience is going to care about. And there's usually some limited bandwidth there. It's probably not your whole spreadsheet that they're going to care about. I know, because I've tried sharing spreadsheets, so I know this one intimately. So all of these relationships also matter. There's a much longer talk about this that I could go into, but I'm going to curb that for now and just say there are really 6 things going on in that storytelling triangle, and I want you to take that away and be thinking about it when you're trying to construct your data stories. And I'm going to move on to say that the real important thing about storytelling is that it makes our information last. It actually creates this situation where people might be able to not just tell our stories, but also hear and retell our stories, remember them in their minds enough that there's something there that's worth retelling to them. So if the point is not just telling, The point is actually not that data goes into our heads and we're able to tell it to other people. The point is actually that the data might travel, we hope accurately, we fear inaccurately. I will just pause and mention for a minute that the danger here is that people retell your stories inaccurately, or of course that there be misleading information. I was called in I was very honored to be called in to have a phone conference with the World Health Organization recently to talk about storytelling, and they're using the term infodemic, a kind of pandemic of information to describe the information crisis around the COVID-19 pandemic right now. So yeah, we're having some real struggles in that area around data at the moment as a society, for sure. So if the danger is inaccurate retelling, the gold standard is retelling accurately, which would be it would look slightly differently than a pie chart to a bar graph that has different sizes and shapes for the colors. So it would look the same, or it would look like the data that's the same data translated into a different way. It is important to be able to tell your data different ways, not because it should be inaccurate, it should always be accurate, but you need to be able to talk to different audiences. So the point really is telling your data well enough that someone else can also tell it. In library contexts, as librarians, sometimes we are the storytellers, and sometimes we are really the people who are trying to tell people a story that we hope that they will repeat and carry forward. So the real point is to have something worthy of telling, and that's what I'm and retelling. So let me pause and come back before I go to questions, just open the floor to you. Pause and come back to that question I asked you at the beginning. What's the biggest obstacle to telling your data stories? And I'll give you a few examples, and I'll tell you right up front that I also have these in a questionnaire that I'm gonna, that Tamara has graciously offered, that the ILA will share with members in upcoming newsletters, so that you can think about what the answers might be. But here's some possible answers. Do you have not enough data? Do you have not the data that you need? You might just not have the data that you need. You might have lots of data, but not the particular one that you need right now. Maybe you just have too much data and you actually have what you need, but it's kind of lost in your file storage, and that's a problem too. Is there too little focus on story? Are you trying to show a spreadsheet and have that interpret itself? That usually doesn't work. So maybe that's the problem. Or maybe there's too much focus on storytelling. Maybe people are talking and telling stories, but it's not really connected to the data that you have as an institution. Maybe there's too much focus on the data and it's just completely disconnected from storytelling. Nobody's even talking about it. And that would be a difficult place to be too. We often have too little time to gather or interpret data, and that does take time, especially interpretation. We tend to underestimate that. Humans do that interpretation. It's not so much that answers are in data, and we hope it's not just that we find what we are looking to see. We hope that data really informs us, but in order to let that happen, we have to interpret it. Or is there too little time to practice stories? I relate to that myself. It seems like there's always too little time in some ways. Or is it something else? So I would love to know from you about that, because this project is going to go on to be a data storytelling toolkit. Right now, we're really focusing on the storytelling part of it, as you can see. But it's going to go on to be a data storytelling toolkit, and hopefully a grant that will get helpful tools out to libraries and other nonprofits. And with that, I would love to step back, offer you my contact information there. I'm not on Twitter very much right now, but I'm certainly on email. Kate McDowell, just one L. For some reason, they couldn't give me both L's, at illinois.edu. And thank you for your time and attention today. It's really an honor to be with you, and I'd love to hear your questions. Thanks, Melissa. Great question. Great way to start. This is a serious obstacle, presenting data in an easily absorbed, understood format as an infographic. You probably know, and I'm probably not the best expert to tell you all the different tools, but there are a ton of tools out there that you can think about in terms of what your dashboard will do. Even Excel, dare I say, has some pretty good things built into it once you get to playing around with it for a while. Full-blown infographics, there are some online web generators for that. You can actually just look up infographic and you'll find that there's some online generators. That's a great, it's a great obstacle, is presenting the data. And I'll tell you honestly, when I teach the course, I co-teach with Dr. Matthew Turk. He is a data visualization specialist. He comes from astronomy, so he can do data visualization backwards and forwards, and some of this will be relying on him as we go forward. But I think it's helpful to me to know it's a real obstacle, because I think it's part of what we want for the toolkit. Leslie, thank you so much for your comment. Combination of too little time to gather data and too little time to practice stories, as well as the administrators who request data not wanting stories. And this is interesting, isn't it? Yeah, so it's finding a way to get the layers of the organization to have some communication relationship with each other. And I would say that that's an issue of feeling of not being listened to. And I really hear that, because I think storytelling is partly about listening. But those are very helpful. I'm just going to actually, it's made it so loud. I'm just going to screenshot real quick. I'll take your names off. I just want to keep these questions for myself so I can remember. Who else has obstacles you'd like to talk about? And if you're more comfortable speaking, that's fine with me too, but certainly the chat is great. Or other questions that you'd like to think about together. What else prevents your data from being useful to you? Or do you have the time you need to collect data? Maybe that's a question. Or do the systems that you're using right now do a good enough job for you of collecting data? Choosing the really compelling data. Melissa, I really relate. I really relate, absolutely. Yeah. And that's where that thing of like, okay, let's call it a story and say, what's the audience going to follow? What's the character going to be? That's where that seems to come in handy. In my several years of teaching this, that seems to be, it's a challenge, and it's not something you can necessarily, you know, data storytelling is right between things that are more automated and things that are more human focused. I think that's where the field of library and information science belongs as well. We're right in the middle there. And so I like to think about how our data gathering practices tend to be very computationally focused for good reasons. The affordances of the system, what they can or can't gather in terms of data relatively easily. But then there's also this aspect of the human tendencies that we have, and also sort of the human meaning-making capacities that we must exercise in these kind of environments. So yeah, so I think it's figuring out what is the data, what are you learning from the data, and how does that relate to what other people in your organization might need to know? Thanks, Cindy. Yeah, where to start? How many chapters in the story? Absolutely. You know, I don't know if it's helpful to you or not, but it's sometimes I find that when you're in that space of so many stories are possible, I just then pause and think about two things. People usually say, who is your audience? That's a good place to start. It's a useful thing, but let's step back and say, what's the setting? What's the minimal amount that your audience would need to know in order to understand some part of some story of your organization that you would want to share, right? What's the minimal setting they would need to understand? Do they need to understand what a library is? Some audiences do. I don't have to tell you this, right? I mean, we work in the same field. Sometimes you have to start there. Do they need to understand what it means to a community to be able to have access to resources? So Cindy, it is institution specific, and you can probably tell that some of what I know is that I can give you some abstract tools, but they really are situation specific in certain kind of ways. And my goal is to try to figure out how to build some of these abstract tools into that toolkit that will translate well enough from situation to situation. But if you're feeling overwhelmed, I would say just start with one thing. Either start with that idea of the character or start with that idea of the setting. Because either of those things, plot's a little more, you can get lost in plot pretty quickly, but either character or setting, Cindy, would probably be a good starting place, especially if you really make that time to pause and sit down, maybe blank sheet of paper or blank Word document or whatever you do to capture your own thoughts, and really ask yourself, okay, what is the story? What is the story that we need? What is the character going to be? What is the setting people will need to know before they hear it? And it's a little bit easier than just thinking about your audience, because your audience doesn't know what you know, right? You have to get to them somehow. You have to build a story to connect with them. You have to make your data resonate. Lisa, great obstacle. I think that's a really good one. I just want to acknowledge that and say yes, yes, yes. That the engaging colleagues in data interpretation before building story it can be really hard. We're all busy. We all want the meaning to just be there, right? I mean, let's be real about it for a second. When we are making like really intense decisions, and lately libraries have been having to make much more intense decisions about their public services than they have had to in some time, maybe 102 years, not sure, depends on your library, right? But maybe, then that it is so tempting to say, please let me off the hook. Please just let the data tell me what to do. Please just give me information so that I can say right there, that information, that's why we're doing this, right? And the reality is mixed because, you know, the reality is that people have different vantage points, people have different interpretations. And so finding a way to get the support that people should offer each other in terms of data interpretation it can be tricky. So think of it this way. You can use something from that Enigma code, that idea of asking a question and trying to find the answer. You might be able to use that as a hook to get people involved. So imagine that you had a question about some loan periods, a question about what they should be, right? Things have been changing lately and you need to figure out if you've got the right loan periods. So let's say you have the question and you have some answers. You have what your loan periods have been, and you've got some data about that, and you can show some things about the data. So if you bring a question and say, what should the optimal loan period be? Your subsidiary question is going to be, what has the loan period been and how has that worked so far? So you ask that question, you show your colleagues some data about that, and you might be able to engage them in thinking about this. This might not even be the best example. It depends really on what you're working on, but it might be that you can get them to engage in that way. But I think that as an obstacle, Lisa, that is a really useful obstacle to highlight. That makes a lot of sense to me as somebody who's often working on teams and on projects with different people. Absolutely. What else would be helpful to talk about while we are here together? We still have a few minutes before we have to wrap up at the hour, and you've given me such wonderful examples of obstacles. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so Emily's asking a question. It can be as simple as painting a picture, creating a compelling metaphor. So what I'd say is when I talk about data storytelling, and this goes back to that earlier definition, data storytelling is really, the data stories are really about using narrative strategies to be able to present accurate evidence. So accurate evidence, when you think of it as accurate evidence may or may not fit a story structure. And the accuracy of the data is more important in this kind of storytelling than the compelling nature of the story. So I would say that you're never really working alone in storytelling because you always want to think about who's that first audience where you're going to rehearse things with. Who's that first, prior to the public presentation, who's that first audience that you're going to run things by? I told you this presentation is based on a paper. That paper was vetted by 2 colleagues before I made it into a presentation to bring to you. So are we ever really alone in storytelling? Probably not. Probably we need an audience, but you have to think about what's the appropriate audience. At your library, there are going to be some things that you would share with coworkers in similar positions, and that would be the appropriate audience. And sometimes that's where you're going to rehearse your stories best. And then if there are other times where you're really needing to reach outside of your library. Maybe, you know, I have a good friend who's been working as a director. And one of the things that's happened lately with some of these challenges is people really need to talk across different libraries to see what they're doing. I'm sure that someone in your library has been doing this and trying to just understand kind of where those connections can be made. So a great way, I mean, I don't have to tell you this because you're here at ILA, but a great way to connect with people who are who are going to be willing to be those early, you know, trying things out audiences for you, is to think about who in your professional networks has that kind of space. Yeah, so obstacles include not having an audience yet, of course, but mostly we think of us, we have an audience, we have the audience of the public, and if anything with libraries, sometimes it's trying to get the audience's attention. There are ways to do that too that might be useful to think about for this kind of data storytelling work. What else is useful to think about for folks who are here. I'll pause and wrap up a little bit, and Tamara, if you have anything else that you want to offer, that would be terrific. But so the goal here, the goal that I'm working on this summer is to begin to construct a data storytelling toolkit. And in order to get there, there's a little questionnaire where we've got this list of obstacles and an optional place to write any other obstacles that come up for you. You can rank the obstacles as we have them in the questionnaire. And then we'll be looking at that evidence, and then also in select cases, depending on, it really will depend on people's positions in libraries and things like that, but trying to select to figure out where we need more data on our end, trying to target this across libraries and nonprofits. So one organization I've been really grateful to work with is Forefront. They're a network of nonprofits across the state of Illinois. They had I've given several talks for them before, and they had a workshop, they had a live webinar last week where they did a lot of networking, encouraging one another, just kind of supporting the process of nonprofit work at this time, and trying to find ways to build these reflective spaces. I think of what this webinar offers for folks at ILA as being kind of a reflective space that you can take advantage of to maybe reframe some of how you see your work, how you think about your work, how you approach the overwhelm, right? I mean, I really, going back to Cindy's question, so many stories are possible, right? And yet they're not all going to be productive in terms of the goals that you might have. So in some ways, it always comes back to what are those concrete goals? What are you trying to achieve? And then where would you start from there? So if there aren't any other questions, I'd be glad to take other questions if there are, but if there aren't any other questions, Tamara, do you have anything else you would want to add?
No, I don't. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Kate, for the wonderful presentation. If you want to jot down Kate's information, so in the next couple of days, next week possibly, you have some additional questions for her or start a dialogue.
Right, well,
I'm sure she'd be definitely open to that.
Oh,
you can also reach out to
yeah.
Oh,
glad to offer it, and yes, the questionnaire is probably a great way to get in touch further, and I hope this was helpful to let you, and the slides, one thing I have offered is the slides, part of my gift and also request for input through that questionnaire, is that the slides will be available to you, so so you'll be able to look back at those and think about the different aspects of narrative strategies, kind of what strategy are you going to take to understand your data, narrative structures, what structures are going to be the best to pull data together into story form, and then troubleshooting. How do you figure out what might have gone awry in any of the aspects of communication? Is it the story? Is it the teller? Is it the audience in some way? Not to blame the audience at all, but just is there some mismatch between? And then what are those relationships that might show you even more? So.
And also just to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the ILA website.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and mute, and I'll just check in with Tamara and see if there's anything else there. And I hope you all have a wonderful week, and stay healthy, stay safe, and may you also stay as well as possible in every way. All right, take care. Bye-bye.